on Wednesday, the 28th of September, with Catherine Sifka in the chair. Of course, I wasn't here last week. I was actually at a talk where the guy was talking about refugees and kept on trying to say hijab and instead kept on saying jihad. There was a woman walking down the street with a jihad on her. I hope by now you're getting to know the haste and our little foibles, like calling the chair the auditor while secretly praying we never get audited. Last year we audited with Julia, and as a joke we always used to call her mom, as in like, mom told us to tidy up in here. And when Ronan got elected, we thought it'd be really funny to call him daddy. It turns out he was really into it. Largely because he normally calls Annabelle daddy. This week is Careers Week, which means it's the time of year when all the fourth years in the HIS sneak into the back of talks about working in finance and promise themselves they can still be Marxists on the weekend. Last week was Know Your Union Week, where people who get paid to live in duplex apartments on campus try to convince us that handing out condoms justifies mandatory student union fees. But speaking of condoms, I don't know if you've been to the centre on Westland Row, but behind the counter they have a section marked Health and Beauty, where they sell condoms and vodka, which, to be fair, does tick those boxes. I've had a pretty ironic week myself. I was at a time management seminar that ran a half hour over and had a panic attack over losing my anxiety meds. And with that, the meeting adjourned.
Are there any objections to assigning this as a true and accurate reflection of the last private business meeting, Ronan? There being none, I shall duly sign something.
Hi everyone, welcome to the HIS. This is just private business where we work through the internal matters of the society before going back upstairs and coming back down with our guests to start the actual debate properly. So it's quite formal, so we'll just run through it relatively quickly. So Mr. Treasurer, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Mr. Librarian?
The time for questions is now open.
Madam Record Secretary, are there any reports to be read?
There are no reports to be read.
Are there any motions on notice?
There are no motions on notice.
Are there any motions not on notice?
There are no motions on notice.
Which brings us to general business. Is there any general business? Yes, there is.
Yes.
There's
Privileged motion number 8, motion to establish a pub subcommittee for the hacks.
Seconded.
Right.
Seconded.
Are we going to take a vote?
Yeah, no, it's passed, it's passed.
I don't know, and I don't care, and I presume it was just a drunk hack, and they're gonna leave, and nothing more is gonna happen from it. There is another subcommittee. So this is a slightly more serious subcommittee. So this is a privilege motion number 8, a motion to establish an electoral subcommittee for elections. We have 2 vacancies for events convener and for member of committee. The way this works is that nominations are now open. In order to nominate yourself for a member of committee, you must have spoken once in the chamber. In order to nominate yourself for events convener, you must have spoken 3 times in the chamber. Nominations will close next Friday evening after our Derby of Rhetoric, and the election itself will take place on Monday upstairs in the committee room. More details about this will be sent out in our weekly email and also on Facebook and stuff. But if you've any interest in like getting involved in his committee or anything like that, I really recommend you check it out and run. Ollie Donnelly will be the chair of the electoral subcommittee.
Seconded.
Right, is there any more general business? No, in that case, Mr. Treasurer, for the second time, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Mr. Librarian?
The time for questions is now closed.
And I hand you back over to the chair to adjourn the meeting.
There being no further business, the meeting adjourned.
Isn't that this is the wrong way around? But like, sure. We'll know.
Because you're first prop.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, yeah, but props will be over there. Yeah, props.
I call this House to order and call upon the Record Secretary to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
The last public business meeting was held on the 28th of September with Carol Coleman in the chair. Long with the HISP been accused of being trumped up, and last week we finally proved it. Trump reminds me of nothing so much as an overgrown tabby cat, because we all know if cats could talk, they'd be braggadocious racists who rant incoherently about beauty queens at 3 in the morning. Or at least that's what I think when my cat jumps on my bed at that time. Trump, of course, got caught out badly in the presidential debate because he hadn't deleted his tweets. If he'd taken a lesson from Phil, he'd know to delete his tweets, his Facebook posts, and burn every copy of the newspapers he could get his hands on. And then afterwards, it turns out Trump pays his taxes in the exact same way that I pay attention to Ronan, which is of course not at all. But of course, this week's debate is about men, and a lot of people assume that because I'm a lesbian, I must automatically hate men, but that makes absolutely no sense. Why would I hate men when I'm not the one having unsatisfactory sex with them? Yeah, 2 seconds. It's fine.
And are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting?
I don't know.
No.
I should now like to call upon the auditor to introduce the invited guests to this house.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank all our guests for coming this evening. This evening we have our chair is Angela Nagel. Angela writes about politics and digital culture for the Baffler, the Irish Times, and Dublin Review of Books. She's the co-editor of Ireland Under Austerity with Manchester University Press and author of a forthcoming book on the online culture wars, Kill All Normies with 0 books. Our proposition guest tonight is Dr. Amanola Dasandi, who got his PhD from Glasgow in 2009. Dr. Dasandi joined University College Cork in 2015 as a senior lecturer in contemporary Islam after 6 years in the US. He has twice been invited to lead Time for Reflection at the Scottish Parliament. He's been a regular contributor to BBC Radio Scotland's Thought for the Day for over 10 years. Our opposition guest tonight is Liam Logan. He stood in several elections over the last number of years campaigning on the issue of fathers' rights. Our standing orders for this evening are that speeches will be 7 minutes in length, with a clap at the first minute, the 6th minute, and a double clap at the 7th minute. So that means the first and last minute of your speech are protected time, so no one can offer you any questions or anything like that. But in the middle few minutes, we would welcome any questions from the floor, so anyone in our audience can stand up and say something along the lines on that point, or information or something like that. And if the speaker accepts you, then you can ask a question, whatever you like. Please keep those about 15 seconds or less, and if the speaker waves you down, please just do sit down and don't offer another point of information for another 15, 20 seconds or so. And finally then, you see the oratory returns in front of you. They look like this. On the inside of them, they have the names of all the speakers. Please fill those out. There's some pretty comprehensive guidelines on the side for how you should fill those out. We usually, at the end of the year, we calculate awards that we give out to our speakers, so they are quite important to those people. So please do fill those out for the debate. You'll notice that we're actually doing 2 more speeches. We're doing 2 floor speeches tonight as well, by Jack Kennedy and Kevin Smith. But you don't need to record their speeches because they're probably not that good.
Shame.
I got a lot of slagging. I feel I need to bully someone else. Without further ado, though, I'd like to hand you back over to the chair.
Lord, it's not that funny. So I'd like to start off this speech by saying what I like to think that we're all thinking at this point, which is that boys have cooties and smell like Lynx Africa, and I think that that's enough to carry this motion on its own, to be perfectly honest with you. So to start off with a bit of a definition of masculinity in terms that I'm going to be talking about it tonight, I think that any definition that I give here is going to be flawed and challenged by the opposition. But basically what I want to talk about are the traits that are traditionally associated with / imposed on men by society. So, you know, like the dichotomies of masculinity being active where femininity is passive, masculinity being physically and emotionally strong whereas femininity is traditionally seen as weaker. And the reason that I give those sort of dichotomies is because I am a firm believer in the fact that masculinity and femininity are inherently defined in opposition with each other, and that is going to come through a lot in my speech. Also, I'd like to point out at this stage that I also think that femininity is massively harmful. But the reason that I think that we're having this debate specifically is because that women tend to talk more about the idea of femininity being harmful than men do talk about masculinity being harmful, particularly in the context of like dismantling femininity, and that is generally something that we are more culturally aware of, whereas masculinity gets talked about in this context a lot less because it's generally seen as advantageous, so we don't sort of analyse it to the extent that we do with femininity, and I think that that's a problem that we're solving with this, by having this debate. So what I'm doing tonight is I'm going to take issue with the traits of masculinity, but also the way that it is packaged, that those traits are sort of pushed all together and imposed on people in society, and also imposed as something that is advantageous and as something that is to strive for. And I know that there are probably going to be people, because I have read the opposition's Facebook posts when they shared this event. So I know that people are going to get up and say that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is more part of the patriarchy than masculinity itself. What I would say to that is that I don't think that you can disentangle those two things that easily. I think that they are both inherently part of each other. I think that masculinity is inherently part of the patriarchy and defined in relation to it. And that is also going to come through in my speech. So what I want to move on to then is like one of the primary things that I see as being defining within masculinity, which is the idea of dominance, right? So when I say this, I basically mean not only dominance, but also a strong sense of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, that, you know, is then again defined in opposition to the idea of femininity relying on someone else or on something else. And I think that this manifests itself in a determination to be independent, a determination to prove that you can do something on your own and that you don't need help with that. And I think that comes in with the idea of, you know, manning up. That again, men have this like people who buy into masculinity have this idea that they need to prove that they are more masculine than everyone else. And I think that that's really harmful because you then get this sort of situation where men don't refuse, but are a lot less likely to ask for help in situations where they don't want to have their masculinity taken down from them. And you also have that situation with women, particularly from my experience at least, where I am less likely to ask for help when I'm in a situation with a lot of men because I don't want to be seen as being overly feminine, because I think that will then be disadvantageous for me. And I think that this leads to a lot of the problems that I have with masculinity, insofar as it harms men in terms, Oh yeah, sorry, absolutely. Like, I'm definitely on board with people subscribing to their own, gender norms, like whatever traits they want to assign to themselves. What I'm talking about here, though, is the idea that we have packaged certain traits together under, the system of masculinity, and that continues to be sold, as one coherent system, that is, again, defined, by these certain things that are supposed to go together, and that again are seen, because of the place of men in society, are seen as advantageous and are seen as something to strive for. So what you then end up with is not only men who are who feel as though they are pigeonholed into certain places, but also with women who then are put at more of a disadvantage because they are afraid to be overly feminine in certain situations, because they know that with masculinity being the dominant, being seen as more of the dominant part in that dichotomy, that is then going to be disadvantageous for them. And then you have both men and women suppressing parts of themselves that they shouldn't need to, but that they find that it is more advantageous for them to do so. And I think the reason that, no thank you. Basically, the thing here is like, obviously, like, you know, femininity is massively harmful to women as well, but I think, again, going back to that idea that women are more open about examining, that generally society is more open about examining the harmful effects of femininity. What you get then is this idea of men expending, in my experience, expending a lot more energy and time and effort proving that they are as masculine as they can possibly be, where I don't think that you get that with femininity. So I think that what you get is, with masculinity, a case where those who subscribe to that, to those gender norms, are constantly trying to prove that they are more masculine than other people. To put this simply, I think that my parents would be a lot more accepting of me, you know, wearing the plaid shirt that Ollie gave me 2 years ago than, you know, they would be of the son that my dad wished he'd had of me wearing the dress that I'm wearing right now. So basically, like, I think that one of the most damaging aspects of masculinity is that people are a lot less willing to dismantle it than they are with femininity. And so the damaging aspects of it become so much more damaging. And then the other side of masculinity we have is, because it exists, as I see it in this dichotomy with femininity, is that you get like systemic repression of those feminine aspects of people who subscribe to masculinity as a gender norm. So what you end up with then is this idea of, like, you know, manning up, of like repressing certain feelings, certain like things that are not likened to like ideal masculine traits, things that are then not dealt with, feelings that are then not dealt with. And that, because this is whole, like, comes back into the idea of dominance and self-reliance, that these things are just sort of, there's an unwillingness to talk about feelings that are associated, like, with anything that is not masculine. And, you know, again, you have, like, the idea of that, you know, manning up versus stop being such a, can I say pussy in the chamber? Too late. And, you know, the fact that we have that rhetoric, the fact that we have that dichotomy is indicative of society's attitude towards masculinity and femininity. And so, to sum up, I would say that I think masculinity is harmful in itself, I think it's harmful in its relation with femininity and society in general, and I would beg you to propose.
Okay, so if anyone would like proof of any of the statistical claims I make in this debate, please do feel free to talk to me afterwards. I have them all saved on my laptop because, hoo boy, some of this is going to be controversial. So, first off, I want to credit the people who originally came up with most of the arguments I'll be using tonight. Two women named Alison Tiemann and Karen Strawn. They're two women who make videos on YouTube regarding gender issues, and each of them describe themselves as men's rights activists, or MRAs. Karen Strawn in particular is a working-class bisexual woman who is the most famous MRA in the world, and is basically the entire reason anyone has heard of that term. If you're wondering why you've never heard that fact mentioned when people were discussing that issue before, consider it an education in how people telling you things often give you a skewed, inaccurate account. Sometimes for political gain, for reasons that like the delivery doing it, but often because it's down to their own life experiences. These specific experiences they've had that skew their perspective on issues and means they don't know all the facts about issues, therefore they can't give you a perfectly accurate account. Which brings me to the first issue I sort of have with how this debate is happening, because it's happening in a college. And unfortunately, college and university is an institution that most people in society don't get to have access to. Specifically, poorer people in society get way less access than those who are richer. In Dublin, it has been shown that your postcode has more of an influence than your IQ on the probability that you will get to go to college. And it's really unfortunate when you're trying to discuss an issue like this that so broadly affects all of society, that is so broadly influenced by the kind of work that everyone in society does, when such a massive group in society is excluded from that. Specifically, I want to talk about how masculinity relates to the kind of work that poorer men tend to do, the kind of work that props up society, and is essentially crucial to how our society functions, right? Specifically, dangerous work, specifically work that is damaging to your body. 92% of workplace deaths over the past 20 years were male, and the vast majority of workplace injuries were as well. Crucially, that kind of work is stuff that's like fundamental to the economy that we live in actually working. It is things like work on farms, to, food production to happen so that people get to eat. It is things like work on oil rigs to allow oil for the transportation that we use, or to make plastics that are used that are used for incredibly important things. And people in this room and throughout society directly benefit from that, and directly benefit from the psychological construct of masculinity that allows that work to occur. Historically, it's always been men who've done that kind of like more dangerous, more damaging work. And it's always been masculinity that has been based and constructed around that. Importantly, that doesn't mean that women haven't done work. Women's work has always been incredibly fundamentally important to how society works. For example, in medieval Europe, the brewing and weaving industries were effectively run by women. But importantly, the most dangerous and damaging work to your body has always been done by men, and masculinity has always been a fundamental part of that. Even if someday, as some people have suggested, we'll have communism based around robots doing the really bad job. Like, even if we someday do get to that, right? It's still been masculinity and men doing that work that allowed us to get to the point where that kind of thing was possible. It allowed us to have the abundance of resources to allow that to happen, right? Okay, I'll take Stephen.
Do you not think it's incredibly damaging with men that they have been pre-prescribed into jobs that condemn them to death?
Okay, Stephen, hang on. Stephen, suggest an alternative way for the economy to actually work and for all of society to function. Then you can make that claim. And stop benefiting from the society you currently live in. Because otherwise, it is just hypocritical to claim that. Furthermore, I'd like to address the idea of male stoicism, that part of a male gender, right? I think it is important to understand that there can be a massive value to a community of having that. One of my best friends in the world is a trans man. I was the first person he came out to and who he told about his gender identity issues and the suicidal thoughts that went around that. And if I hadn't been brought up in a male gender role, I honestly don't think I would have been able to deal with listening to that and getting through that. And if I hadn't done that, I don't know if he'd still be around today. I think that there is a massive value sometimes to having someone who can have that kind of stoicism within your community. And it is important to understand that value, to be able to see the bad side of it, see why people think to that in cases where it isn't useful anymore, and to convince them not to do that in cases where it stops being useful. I would also like to point out that, what Jay said, people not asking for help. Sometimes, a community has limited resources it can ascribe to the people within that community, and decisions need to be made about who it's given to. For example, when states are making decisions about healthcare, they tend to prioritize health, initiatives specifically for women to give money to. And being male and being able to accept that you won't get as much help from the state in that case can be an incredibly important thing if a community just doesn't have enough resources to give you those things, because an individual man is just always less important to the continuation of a community than an individual woman is. And it might be that we're at a case now where we have enough resources that we can look after everyone, but it's important to understand that construct of masculinity is what got us to that point in the first place. Okay, I'd now like to move on to talking about violence and about whether masculinity is linked to that. Firstly, given that it's often claimed that it is, unfortunately the Prof hasn't said that yet, but it will probably come up later down the house. Firstly, I would like to point out that empirically you receive a massive discount in each step of the justice system for being female or for being white. Therefore, it is very difficult to compare male and female rates of violence because conviction rates are massively affected by those biases within the justice system. I would specifically look at sexual violence and studies regarding that and the comparison between what I found and what's generally regarded in society. No, thank you. A study of college women in New York in 1998 found that between 26% and 43% of respondents reported engaging in strategies that would be defined as coercive if applied to male respondents. Further, 20% of the women reported using physical force, 27% the threat of physical force, and 9% a weapon to obtain sexual contact with a male partner. Admittedly, that is one of the most extreme studies I've found, but I can find you dozens more studies finding results broadly along those lines. So why is that so different to most reports you'll see about what proportion of rapists are male? It's actually very simple. It is entirely to do with the definition of rape used by most stats gathering agencies, saying that it necessarily involves the penetration of the victim's body, which obviously excludes cases in which women commit sexual violence. For example, the CDC 2010 study had a specific subheading called Made to Penetrate, which is effectively what the average person would consider to be a woman raping a man. They found that the number of men made to penetrate over the past year was exactly the same as the number of women raped. Most sexual violence in male prisons are actually female guards sexually abusing male prisoners, and there are loads of other studies on this issue, right? It is important to note that it was a deliberate choice not to publicize those crimes. Mary Koss, a CDC researcher, said that it is inappropriate to consider as a victim of rape a man who engaged in sex with a woman unwillingly. And it's important to see the things they said before making those decisions. It is important to see that they specifically said that masculinity was inherently harmful, and by seeing masculinity as inherently harmful, it made it extremely difficult for them to see any other ideology as being capable of causing harm, of seeing feminine ways of influencing society, and of seeing that as being capable of being harmful. Because if you see such a big, wide construct as being so inherently damaging, it becomes incredibly difficult to see other things as being inherently damaging, and it means you miss out on other ways of understanding society and of influencing it, right? It means you miss out on all the ways in which women can influence society in both incredibly positive and incredibly negative ways. It means that you stop being able to see the world as it really works, and that is incredibly important to being able to build a better world going forward. Thank you.
I waved them for healthy competition, but I probably... To the chair, ladies and gentlemen, bros and babes alike, welcome. I'm here to uphold the motion that masculinity is inherently harmful, which is quite an ambiguous motion to uphold. Now, in arguing this, I'll be arguing that you cannot define masculinity unless it is understood in a duality with femininity. And this is to say that masculinity is anti-femininity. Now, these are both gendered concepts. I want to start by saying these are both gendered concepts. But to that effect, they should not be sexualized because our concepts of gender have advanced over the years, and thus it allows for more room for argument. The categorizations of masculinity and femininity are incredibly interesting because they don't have reference in the external world. They aren't something that we can refer to casually either. They're incredibly meaningful terms. In this sense, they are less properties or aspects of characters, but they are an evaluation of personhood. They constitute what is a valuable person, what is a valuable experience. And they both do these through a process of negation. Masculinity will rarely tell you what it is, but it will rather tell you what it is not. It will argue what, it will nitpick. And to back this up, I challenge you tonight to find in your neighbor an affirmative consensus of what masculinity or femininity constitute. Are they visual or behavioral qualities? Are they both? Are they something more? Masculinity is often portrayed within a certain hierarchy and seen as preoccupied with a status as impregnable. But paradoxically, as I've already brought up, it can only negatively affirm itself. It assumes from its incipient stages that it is under assault, and its existence is therefore a process of justification. It is in this justification that masculinity is harmful. It represents femininity as something that is unjust. It is its opposite. Is it coincidence that the original sin belongs to woman? Is it mere coincidence that women have been bound, marginalized, and owned by the Constitution by virtue of their femininity or otherness? And here, a problem arises. Although I argued that these aren't sexualized concepts, it is to maintain this hierarchy that seems to be inbuilt into masculinity. It has to sexualize the concepts. Yes?
Is masculinity inherently harmful, or is masculinity harmful when taken to its extremes?
Masculinity is inherently harmful because it is purely reactive. It is always defending and trying to justify itself. Yes?
Trying to defend itself. What's the name of this debate?
That masculinity is inherently harmful. And in doing this, there are wrong ways in which to defend yourself. For example, if I was to slur your character, we would have a consensus in the room that if you were to murder or assault me, that it would probably not be proportionally correct. Anyway, yes, a problem has arisen, it seems, that to be feminine is to be a woman. And does it work conversely that to be masculine is a man? I say yes to this, because to be masculine is to be rapacious and regressive. For can it not be observed societally that in a bid to grapple with social changes, a more forceful femininity, the gradual moves to reconceive gender, masculinity has sometimes sardonically but definitely embraced certain women as fitting a more manly cast or sporting non-feminine qualities. An example of this phenomenon would be tomboys, or the butch women of colloquial conversation. An illustration of this point would be BIC, the pen manufacturer's South African ad campaign last year, think like a man, look like a girl, think like a man, work like a boss. That inspired online outrage. There seems to be compelling evidence in this, that masculinity believes itself just in its maintaining of, in its seizure of control, and it sees itself as justified. In thinking like a man, you become part of the authority. You become the patriarchy. The subtext is clear that you can only work within the system if you are willing to become man. Masculinity, in its attempt to solicit itself as the rightful bastion against otherness, has resorted to a tactic of reducing all relationship with these others to a process of sexualization, by which I mean the exploitation, fetishization, and marketing of the other's body. And in doing this, it takes the body of the other and immediately tries to only give it a connotation of desirability, whereas the male counterpart has both a sense of desirability and an immense sense of power, whether it be in terms of its authority or in terms of its muscularity. This is my understanding of how masculinity is inherently harmful, that it tries to emphasize mannishness as a sort of being, whereas alternative categories of identity, whether effeminate, female, trans, or queer, are characterized by their vacuous, yet somehow sacrilegious sense of being. It is the opinion of this speaker that to be unmasculine is to be unworthy. It is to be a type of unperson, and that as a project it must redefine itself for a new century or phase itself out. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the former speaker, firstly, for an excellent maiden speech. It was so well thought out. It's certainly a lot better than mine. But I have to say, I disagree with so much of it, because as I look around this room, and as I look around even my bench, I'm gonna probably do now to take all of that side down. What I did at the last His Stooges collab was just, be a pansexual queer individual of color, and I, having lived around the world, I think my appreciation for how gender roles play out has been shaped by the many different countries I've lived in, the many different almost lives I've lived as being first just the straight good Indian girl, and then being the questioning queer person, then moving to a different country, being the questioning queer person of color in a nation where the narrative is hugely white and patriarchal, and then being a pansexual queer woman of color, which was a fun time. So yeah, while I appreciate what especially Sinead said, while I appreciate what Sinead has said about we shouldn't suppress men's ability to ask for help. We shouldn't buy into the traits and packaging of something that sets itself up so inherently as a dichotomy. I do think the world is changing. I do think from my perspective it is changing to make masculinity more all-encompassing, to make femininity more all-encompassing for women to access masculinity and men to access femininity. We're all-encompassing for queer people to present as trans-masculine or trans-feminine, non-binary people to present as trans-masculine and trans-feminine, and that be okay. And so long as masculinity is one of those choices, and so long as masculinity is a choice that a lot of people want to go for, I think it can never be inherently harmful if it is part of an individual's self-expression. Okay, so I was doing some reading. I found something that's quite provocative, and it makes you think. And yeah, I know Sinead read my Facebook post, but I think I can genuinely use this point to demonstrate that masculinity has to be extricated from the patriarchy before any of this debate can continue. right? Okay, so the weakest expression of power is tyranny, and the weakest expression of protectiveness is war. The weakest expression of accountability is control. The weakest expression of strength is femininity. The weakest expression of will is domination. The weakest expression of sexuality is rape. And the weakest expression of masculinity is the patriarchy, where all they think they are good for is to take and dominate and protect by hurting other people. So yeah, throw away patriarchy. Then what do you get? Maybe someone who is willing to collaborate with their partner and, offer a give and take that protects but also reins itself in. Offer an expression of sexuality that allows for other sexualities, that allows for other self-expression. And I do think that it's really important now to consider this as separate from the hegemony of masculinity, which is conceptualized by queer theorists in the white world. Because hegemonic masculinity is terrible. It is something that is directly structurally inseparable from the patriarchy. No, thank you. But it is not all masculinity. It is not the same kind of masculinity as I choose in the morning when I decide to put on a three-piece suit and I'm like, if anyone wants to challenge me on this, you can fight me. It's not the sort of masculinity that, my ex, who is a trans man, chose way back when they were like, do you know what, I'm going to get bullied for this, I'm probably going to get hit, I'm probably going to have, my own social and mental issues. But this is what I'm choosing for, and this is something for which I will fight. And it is not part of the hegemony, but it is certainly something that's inherent to masculinity as well. It's not a masculinity that people seem to describe as, convenient and assertive and a will that dominates all other wills and all other voices in society. But it is a masculinity. It's a masculinity that someone somewhere is going to wake up and choose every day. And so long as that person, otherwise has no way of expressing the person they are, and so long as that doesn't hurt someone else outside of the hegemony of masculinity, which I've already said is bad, I think that masculinity is actually something really powerful. I think that, I probably agree with Sinead to some point that, it is a trait and it is a package and it is something that you buy into. But we don't do society any good when we say, we're going to pull this deal because we think you should have this other deal instead. We do society a much greater benefit when we, look at society more globally, when we look at society, where you have a lot of the developing world developing its own new narratives about how, they see men in relation to women in relation to other social groups. No, thank you. And so, I don't think that, by removing a package of the two or multiple packages there are in the world, we're doing people any good. I think that so long as, people have something that they can redefine, it can never be bad, because redefining is moving forward. No, thank you. And as a society, I do think we should always move forward. And taking away one of the choices, telling a half or more of the people who may even be in this room that their choice to identify as masculine is wrong. No, thank you. That is just not going to do any good. I will take Jack if you still have it.
So do you think that we can create a masculinity which isn't so domineering as it is, given that it's the cultural monolith that it is, and given that masculinity is inherently rooted in this idea of being the alpha and being in charge?
I absolutely think we can, to be honest. I mean, at the point where we get people embracing metrosexuality day by day, and as day and hour goes on, you get someone else who goes, oh, maybe, I don't have to be 100% butch all the time. I do think that, yes, it's a cultural monolith, but monoliths are like rocks. They're shaped by the waves of human emotion and the waves of social development around the world. They're not something that's necessarily going to stand the test of the time 100% as it is. But I do think that they should be shaped into something beautiful, just like anything else is. Yeah, I think femininity as the stock character woman and the stock character man are probably bad. But I do think that that's not how we see society anymore. That's not how I see society developing here. That's not how I see society developing in India or in any of the other countries I've lived in. And that's, I hope, not where we go from now. I hope where we go from now isn't, throwing out the baby with the bathwater and saying the stock character is all that, every person who would identify as masculine in this room is. I hope we realize that people have more nuance and depth than that, and I hope we realize that the world has more scope for development than that. And so I urge you to vote.
Thank you, and good evening. I would firstly like to thank you for this kind invitation, in particular the organising committee, especially Grace. Masculinities are lived out in the flesh, but fashioned in the imagination. These are the words of Graham Dawson, the academic that many within the field of masculinity studies would agree with. Is masculinity inherently harmful? But before we begin to debate if it is harmful, let's ask ourselves, what is masculinity? Where do our perceived notions come from? And to take a moment to think about this. Is masculinity harmful? Now you might be thinking, well, surely the answer to this might be no. Not all forms of masculinity are harmful. Yes, to that I would also agree. But let's be honest. When you think about masculinity, what ideas about men and masculinity do you think about? Boys being boys. He's such a lad. Och, the lads will always chase the ladies. Chuckle, chuckle, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But let's look at this seriously. Because surely it is a serious matter when we think about the effect this has on those who don't fit these idealized notions of what it means to be a man. Rigid notions of masculinity continue to cause crisis in the world today. And this is why, friends, masculinity as we imagine it and impose it on young men and women is inherently harmful. More than ever before, we are looking at this seriously. The Irish Times is running a spectacular series at the moment on how to be a man. Be a man! How many young boys have been told or scolded with this, even though forms of logic, rationality, sociology, biology tell us that no two men are alike? As we know, our own understanding and identities, gendered and sexual, are constructed as we interact with that which surrounds us. We are all individuals, yes. So who on earth came up with this singular notion of masculinity, and why is it not being challenged? There are no two men alike. There are no two individuals alike. Yet masculinity is more often than not presented in the model of a stereotypical heterosexual man, butch, strong, muscled, the husband, the father, the patriarch. I may be showing my age here, but think back. Oh, that Diet Coke advert, that milk tray man, the man from Del Monte. What are the psychological effects of this on individuals and the organization of society? Is there a moral and ethical debate to be had on why we must accept that these political and societal norms of masculinity are damaging? This masculinity is harmful to men who are trying ever so hard to live up to it. I see it every time I work out at the gym with my personal trainer. Ambiguity in our identities do not help those who want to organize society. Because isn't it the case that a singular approach is easier to box? But I'll let you into a secret. Human lives are not as neat as texts. Are we not all seeking neat boxes of gender and sexuality? Men go to the men's toilets and women to theirs. Masculinity in binary to the women's toilet is harmful because we have individuals in our society who don't identify as a man or a woman. Now let me complicate this a little further. I'm the worst person to invite to dinner because as soon as someone asks me what I do for a living, I tell them I work on the study of religion, particularly Islam. And as they hesitate back, I also add, oh, Islam, gender and sexuality. Conversation stopper. But because I have your attention this evening, let me complicate this further by arguing that this harmful form of masculinity is connected to the way that these harmful men have read out and into religious traditions. I'll let you into another secret. Religions don't actually speak. Christianity says, Judaism says, Islam says is absolute nonsense because it is the people who speak for these religions who is speaking for these religions. Yes, you're catching on to this argument. Those manly commentators and leaders who uphold this harmful masculinity. Let me explain through the example of Islam and Muslims. Maulana Maududi was a political theologian, an influential religious figure during the time of partition between India and Pakistan. Now we're talking 20th century. This man, Maududi, promoted a singular vision of masculinity and femininity. In a way, all the stereotypes of what men should be doing and women should be doing, he preached it. The way in which Maududi strengthened his ideas of gender roles and sexuality through his interpretation of the text and law continues to carry weight for many Muslim men and is often not challenged because it upholds the status quo of men at the center. A 20th century political Islamist, Maududi hardened the conceptions of Islamic masculinity by aggressively interpreting scripture, collapsing it with historical precedent, and presenting his own views and idea as theology. Here's the important point. As tantamount to God's opinions and ideals, we could quite easily find Maududi within Jewish or Christian communities too. But back to Islam for a moment. We all know that 1 billion or so Muslims globally hold the Quran as a divine scripture that came from God. Surely these scriptures, surely that text should tell us what it means to be a man. Similar to the way Jews look to the Hebrew Bible or Christians to the New Testament. These are texts which shape lives. But are they as neat as some would like us to believe? As a divine text, the Quran is a fantastic place to read out particular political and social position. But in my view, it is a text. And texts, especially sacred scripture, are full of dysfunctional, gendered and sexual stories. And so we need to interrogate how our understanding of traditions and texts are shaped by male readings, which then help develop a harmful masculinity that any sane and rational person would condemn. When we look at these sacred scriptures, and I would say this can also be held true for examples of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, or even the Bhagavad Gita, how does one support the rigidity in masculinity? If we look at the example of the Quran, for example, as a sacred text, or biblical prophets, was it their lived examples, their gender, their marriages, their lack of marriages that lead us to a concrete conclusion of Islamic masculinity or biblical masculinity? So even these divine texts, whether we agree with them or not, are actually fantastically human. They are messy and just as messy as our lived realities. What was common to all Islamic prophets, was their central relationship and submission to God. These colors make the text a lot more difficult to domesticate. The varieties and shades of these lives then push us to consider, to unbox what our preconceived ideas may be of the Quran, that divine and inimitable text from God, which up close and personal celebrated a variety of different gendered lives and actually does not promote an ideal of masculinity or femininity. Now back to our political commentator, Maududi. The view of masculinity and femininity that Maududi advocated hurt and continues to hurt and damage many who have not conformed. And it is a challenge to us all to firstly accept that masculinity is harmful to all, and then to raise the different ways of being, whether identifying as a man, a woman, or trans or queer. And Islamic communities have examples which challenge the boxed view of the likes of Maududi. Antinomian mystics, challenging all forms, dance at the shrines of their saints in India and Pakistan, gender bending, some identifying as heterosexual, wearing colourful clothing, high on some intoxicant or another, labelling themselves as the brides of God. They stand firm in their conviction that they are both masculine and Islamic. I near my conclusion. Those Muslim feminists who have challenged the Maududi model of masculinity and risen above this to reach new political heights. Those hedonistic Muslim poets such as Mirza Ghalib from India's 19th century, who we never hear from because he was classed as a drunk. With his fondness of women, he was not quite manly enough and not Islamic enough. Yet his poetry is so God-centred, similar to our own Scottish bard Robert Burns. So yes, the first step is to accept that masculinity is inherently harmful, but what is vitally important after this is to look for counter-examples, to look for the colours, the different ways of being. And when we do this, we truly see how beautiful the world is. These counter-examples charge us all to see the damage that is caused by falling trap to understanding and imposing masculinity on individuals in society. And so in conclusion, rigid notions of hegemonic masculinity as the foundations of who we are, how our societies have been shaped, are harmful. I call upon this House to strengthen individuals' agency, capacity, sense of being, to lead full and colourful lives, to raise up those counter-examples, those queer incarnations, as you always have, proudly. And here I think about your former member, Oscar Wilde, a man who was also harmed by masculinity. I call upon all of you to disrupt our neat boxes and displace this masculinity which blinds us to the margins. The colours are there as long as we have the drive and the passion to see the world of difference. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody, and again, thanks again to Grace and others for having invited me here. I was approached to ask to speak at this event tonight as some other people had passed over the invitation, so it came probably a little bit late, and I had seen on Facebook the proposition, which was that masculinity is inherently harmful. That this House believes that masculinity was inherently harmful. And I didn't realise it was a debate, so you had to have a proposer and an opposition. And it jarred at me, because I said, if that had been written, femininity is inherently harmful, we couldn't have had a debate. It just wouldn't have stirred up any interest or something. So that struck me. But the other thing I said to myself, well, if I'm going to interrogate that question, I looked at 4 different words in the proposition. And the first one that this House believes. So at the moment, I'm spending a lot of time reading a fabulous book, which, again, I recommend to you, called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Said, where he talks a lot about cognitive dissonance and the way in which society regularly places narrative at a higher level than data. And this is relevant for me in this topic here, because my difficulty around the whole conversation is, what is the agenda behind the question that masculinity is inherently harmful? I mean, at the opening remark by, I think, the Secretary said this was about men. Now, I'm not really sure if masculinity is about men, that's the first thing, but I'm going to assume that it's about men, right? And therefore, I'll extend that to proposition. The underlying statement here is that men are inherently harmful, and so that to me is what that proposition suggests. So, what I'd ask you as a group of people, and I'm delighted to be able to talk I'm a retired lecturer, and you are at the start of your careers and in an educational space. And my interest in being there is to talk, you are the future, and you're going to create whatever world is out there. And I would like to think you would do it with critical thinking, and I would like to think that you would recognise that in constructing your beliefs, you're facing a narrative right throughout the world which is full of the stigmatisation of masculinity and the demonisation of men. And just, you need to think about that, because there is a counterfactual narrative that simply has been suppressed. And my experience since at 33 years of age, separating with 2 young children of 18 months and 1.5 and 2.5 years old, and becoming the first male in our society to be given equally shared joint physical custody of the children. Just think about this. So we started off from a situation, just because I was male, I was considered to be a second-class citizen. And I've lived all that, but that's all gone. I mean, my kids are grown and gone, they're in their late 20s, they live their own lives. But the history of the fact that I was told because I was a male, I was a second-class citizen. And that when I questioned that, I was called an angry man. So I was boxed into all these hegemonic... Yeah, sorry, I should have said, anybody who wants to ask questions, I'd be delighted. Yeah.
Just on that, do you not think that so much of that is related to the fact that masculinity is packaged in the way that it is?
Oh, I do, and that's what I said at the very start, that the belief systems and the narrative that has informed all the adjudicators of my life have absolutely been these demonic imagization of men. And I said, you know, but I've always felt, I mean, it didn't rancor with me. I mean, I had children who were born, they were magic. I loved them. That's all I knew. I didn't go into hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity and all that stuff. And I did spend a couple of days here, the last few days, running around reading this stuff, and I said, now let's just talk about where I'm at. As a man, that was my future. Now, it also, I believe, tied women into the martyrhood of motherhood. I think that was another issue. But, so I started with the word belief. The second word was masculinity. And again, I'm thinking, like tonight here, I'm blown away because I still don't know. I've had pansexual, heterosexual, metrosexual, XY-sexual, XYZ. Look, I'm just a guy, you know, when I had sex with... I'm a guy in the way I used to think I was a guy. I might be a gay guy. I'm happy about it, but I don't have a problem with it. So I'm happy in my body or whatever it is. And when I was, I was only politicized about the awareness of what it meant to be a man in terms of being stigmatized when I was 33 years of age. Before then, I just went around and had a good time. I probably did all of the things that feminists would argue are bad about guys, etc. But I have no sense that I'm sure I was insensitive in many cases, but I don't think I was necessarily a bad person, etc. Somebody mentioned earlier about they juxtapose dominance in males and self-reliance, and I think they're two totally different things altogether. Completely. I mean, the idea, like Thoreau and Wright and Walden Pond, of going out there and looking and finding out about self-reliance. I mean, self-reliance is completely... Anybody who's self-reliant doesn't need to be dominant. What the fuck do you want to dominate? Get over it. Sorry, the other one to move on to is that inherently, then I said, what does this mean? Because, if it's inherent, what's the point? There's nothing we can do about it. If it's inherently harmful, why are we having this debate? And I was coming up in a bus today, so I said, I better find out what it says about inherent. It said something here about inherent. Inherent, he talked about intrinsic, essential, permanent, inseparable part of the basic nature of something. So we were now saying that men were inherently, so you're locking, this is an inevitable reality for men. And then the last one, harmful. I was asking, what does this mean? Because it's such a loaded statement, it's harmful. What are we talking about masculinity? Who's it harmful to? Well, I'll tell you, there's 6 million men died in the First World War. Most of them were younger than you guys. Most of them were younger than you guys. Didn't make it past the first 10 yards, a lot of them, before they were whacked. And then either ran away with fear, were whacked by their own. So, your question, there's a lot of harm there, all right, but the harm wasn't necessarily, the guys were out there. Most of these people were out there not knowing what they were doing, and they were certainly not out to harm people. So, if you're going to, as a house, vote and accept this proposition, that you believe, then I challenge you have to ask yourself, what is this belief made up of? You may need to look at this counterfactual evidence that has been suppressed in our society. I mean, when I'm on RT with Andy O'Mahony a number of years ago, and he says, but Liam, you're an angry man. That's the way he was dealing with my argument. Let me give you an argument. You people are in the equity base. There's an equity officer in this organisation, I believe. You can go to an equity person now, okay? I'm going to give you a man and a woman. They both look after their children equally. The children live with you for 10 years, and they live with you for 10 years. And there's a thing in Ireland called children's allowance. All your parents have benefited from it. Sorry, all your mothers have benefited from it. Do you think it's a reasonable proposition that a man looking after children half the time, a woman looking after children half the time, that they should be equally treated in that half of the children's allowance would be paid to a man and half would be paid to a woman? It's real simple. There's no further complications about this. Yeah?
Do you not think the problem then isn't necessarily we have a problem for men, but we have a problem with the prescription that's given men from birth that they have to do X, Y, and Z goals, which then further leads into meal suicide, meals being denied parental rights, and that's the actual problem, which is the prescription of what men are supposed to do, and rather not men in general.
Well, firstly, I think the problem is that we're problematizing men. Like, we're telling men they have a problem. And obviously, it was only when I separated, started getting involved in this stuff that I had to pay attention. Then I looked at all the narrative, all the academics who were doing research into men and masculinity. And I am telling you, in the work, I mean, I was introduced here as a father's rights activist. That's not what my background was. My background, I set up a group called Parental Equality to support shared parenting. And the concept of shared parenting is that pre-arousal. Hi, when I meet you, and before we get into pre-arousal, that we actively engage in this business of consent. You know the stuff you're all doing on campus now? Consent, consent, consent. But what are you consenting to? You're not consenting to having sex. That's just the front-ended business. The real question you've been asked yourself is, if you create a pregnancy between you, what are you really consenting to? Are you consenting to being equally respectful, being mutually committed to looking after those children, and will society support you in that business? So the question, I believe, is that we're problematizing, and listen to the proposition, that masculinity is inherently harmful. Now, to prove it, nobody here has proven anything about masculinity, had broad sweep statements about that. I would just say that in coming to this event today, I've spoken to a lot of men over the last week, and I'm 60 years of age. And do you know, I've been an engineering lecturer for 27, mostly to young males. I have never in any conversation with any man ever discussed masculinity. I ask us, what the fuck is masculinity? We're just living being men. Other people, gender, pan, this, whatever the fuck are talking about masculinity. I just want to be a guy, a man. Now, I've been told the world is changing. Don't fool yourselves, guys. Everything changes. Plus ça change, plus la même chose. Everything changes and everything remains the same. So not only would I ask you to reject the motion, but I ask you to leave here and ask yourself, what is behind all these motions? We have problematized young men. I've had lots of young men in my life, students in other words, who have been in those dark places, and they are not helped by being told that they're problems. It will be okay for guys. They need to look at themselves and go into self-reliance. And again, thanks again for listening, okay?
to propose this motion that masculinity is inherently harmful. And I think the first thing we have to do is take a look at the men in this room. Just look at Jack. Trying so hard. He tries to laugh off when we mock him for liking My Little Pony, and it breaks his heart every single time. And Eamon pretending that he's going home to Sligo when he really just needs to get away to cry without being judged. Or Mark trying desperately to fit in, trying to get his lad friends to come watch a debate. Masculinity has been so harmful to Mark that he actually broke 3 bones trying to play football. And just look at the rest of you, just smelling like Lynx Africa and just buying into masculinity. Like, masculinity has definitely harmed everyone here. Okay, so moving on from that joke, we is it a joke though? We joke about men having this white male privilege, and we do joke about that a lot in college, at least among debaters. But that phrase really isn't a joke, because we kind of shout men down when we say things like that. We say that because you're masculine, you must be powerful, you must have this great, dominance, and that you're somehow responsible for the patriarchy and everything bad that has ever happened. And men aren't even allowed to counteract that view without being told that they're white male privilege, that that not all men is shouting down minorities. And that is inherently harmful, because it's not only harming those men individually, it's also harming free speech and counter ideas. And it's making us all be this little safe space, which actually isn't engaging with the real world. People are really quick to point out how historically elite men have oppressed minorities, have oppressed women, but they've actually also oppressed each other. And we have to acknowledge that if we're going to look at masculinity. So my main point, and my only point really, is that masculinity is a stereotype, and that stereotypes are inherently harmful. But first I'd like just to point of clash with what Pod was saying earlier about how men being masculine and doing the dangerous things, being in, say soldiers or mining for gold or whatever, that is for progress. I would say that actually is a point on our side, that men have been forced into these really dangerous jobs because they're deemed masculine. So rather than, having... yeah?
Surely it's just more practical to get the people who are physically stronger and aren't directly carrying babies to do that work in a community when that work needs to be done.
Okay, I would argue that it is actually more practical to keep everyone alive and invent a way of doing those jobs without killing each other, like, say, not going to war. That might be a good way. Yeah, because, no thank you. In war, men are literally expected to die for being masculine. We raise little boys with these toy soldiers and tell them, aspire to die for masculinity, because then you'll be respected. And that is inherently harmful. Mocking men for being pacifists, like Francis Sheehy Skeffington for being feminist when he took his wife's maiden name and he was disowned by his family. Things like that are inherently harmful. It's trying to cause this stereotype of what a man can and can't do and ignoring the individual. It leads to less report of sexual abuse and assault, as Pod was saying earlier as well. Because men are deemed to be masculine and not able to talk about their feelings, they're also not allowed to confess when an issue to their friends that something is really bothering them, or even if they do try, even if they do try to say that to someone, they are given these stereotype answers like, oh, boys don't cry, you're being a pussy, grow up, man up. And those are inherently harmful, because it's getting harder and harder for men to express themselves, especially when we're, again, in this college little liberal bubble where men's rights activists are mocked, but men who actually might have a point are kind of dismissed as not being part of this minority, so not being entitled to have an opinion. This is really, really, really damaging, and it's, yeah, to your point of
yeah, I do. Sorry, this is actually just pertinent to your last thing, so if you want to finish up.
Go
okay.
on.
So yeah, you're talking about, how men are being damaged by not having a voice, by being subject, things that society expects them to do. But what about all the other minorities whom you're leaving out as a result, who actually want to aspire to that masculine ideal? What about those people whom you're telling that no, what you want is terrible for you? Is that the sort of nannying behavior you should be endorsing?
I think that we should look at everyone as individuals rather than saying, okay, well, you're part of this group and you can aspire to join the stereotype, because I think there is a conflict. I think this idea that you have to be, that, oh, if you're gay, you're not masculine, you like effeminate things, you like ballet, that kind of thing. Those are stereotypes that you have to choose between being masculine or being gay or being any other minority. I think that is what masculinity is asking you to do. And if you, like you were mentioning earlier, we try to reform masculinity somehow, I think we'd be moving so far away from the concept as it is that we'd actually just have a brand new concept. And I'd be up for a brand new concept, but the current concept is very damaging. So to continue on from what Sinead was saying earlier, about masculinity being a stereotype and how this is negative for women as well as men. I think I agree completely with her that that masculinity is intertwined with the patriarchy. And if we are trying to have like lean-in feminism, or have women succeeding in the workplace, they're not being asked to identify with their masculine identity, that half of themselves. They're being asked to ignore the feminine side of themselves. They're being told that they have to, they have to do the lean-in feminism, they have to be demanding, they have to stop talking about the things that bother them, they have to be more aggressive, more dominant. And I think it would be much better if instead of doing that, we could just say to everyone, like, everyone just be yourself. We presume that men, because they're traditionally seen as this patriarchy, this elite group of men, that they can't identify with minorities, that they shouldn't have opinions. That if they try to express an opinion on, say, feminism, there are women saying, well, you're masculine, you shouldn't even be allowed to identify as a feminist. You shouldn't be allowed to voice your opinions because you have the wrong idea. Your opinions aren't valid because you haven't experienced this, because you're so masculine. And that's really ignoring the people who are male, who have had very different experiences, who are transgender, who maybe just haven't come out yet, who, yeah, I'm out of time. But basically, stereotypes are really, really bad. We shouldn't encourage them. They reinforce other stereotypes and they prevent people from being themselves. Thank you.
Accept them and no one can offer you a point of information, or you can waive them and anyone from the floor can offer you a point, but you also get a rousing round of applause.
Well, I am a fan of applause, so I will waive my rights. Now, the longer the clap goes on, the less I have to speak, so could you... No. Now, my speech is very interesting because I was kind of rushing it, but... when I was reading up on it, masculinity is generally defined as, by many people, as what we can traditionally see as, traits is the word I'm looking for. Traits ascribed to men, such as kind of strength or boldness, courage or assertiveness. Generally strength, physically, emotionally. But as we've seen before, the definition of anything can be very easily manipulated by either side. So I won't dig too much into this. Now, one of the things I've always thought interesting is that almost anybody can come up with any example where some trait thought to be masculine or feminine can be harmful to some extreme. So, going back to what Sinead is what I'm looking for, said earlier on, I'm very bad at names. She was saying that both masculine and feminine traits can be harmful, and I think when we find things in this way, what we're just saying is that extremism is harmful and that moderatorship is the norm. And this is a very easy thing to say, because almost anybody can agree that nobody should be an extreme person. And were the question of this debate, is extremism harmful? I would very easily be on that side of this bench. But the question is masculinity harmful? And I'm on this side of the bench because I do not see that masculinity and femininity are opposites on some extremist scale. I see them as philosophies which anybody can adhere to. I find my notes are because I've been looking at them for a few minutes. Oh God. There's some idea that no, use that already. Okay, this is a bit of a difficult one. I've lost where I am. There is one idea which I thought would be very interesting, which I haven't seen actually, which we have seen in some sense come up, is that the idea that people who on one side of the fence who move over, people who are seen as feminine who are actually male, or who identify as female who are seen as masculine, people like this are generally seen by society as inferior to people who, do adhere to these kind of gender roles. And this to me would have been kind of an interesting debate to have had. But, sorry, where's my bloody notes? I mean, especially recently, like with the rise of kind of, what's the word? Kind of the stay-at-home dad, like as my colleague here was talking about, and the idea that people can kind of steer from these roles. It makes sense that this ideal is no longer kind of presented, but I just wanted to address it anyway because first thing that I thought when I started watching it. Alright, I am very bad at this. Now, the last thing I wanted to say, because again, I didn't have much time to write, and I'm not very good at this, is going back to the extrication of masculine identities from the patriarchy. So, I mean, always for me, I've always found that like the idea that the patriarchy is a representable ideal is something very interesting, because it's a lot of people think of it as, you know, 6 white old men smoking cigars, drinking champagne in a, you know, darkened room. You know, and this doesn't exist. So whenever we try to relate this back to things like masculinity and femininity, there's a problem, because, you know, it's actually just a series of small interlocking things, which might give this impression but aren't actually it. So it's very difficult for people to discuss things like this and then kind of apply them to the topic they're discussing. And that's, yeah, one of the things I was thinking. And then, you know, lastly, I have to disagree with you on one point, Dr. Sunday. You did say, you said that you're the worst person to invite to the dinner party. But in fact, I'm the worst person to invite to the dinner party. Because, like you, I am very interested in religion and how it relates to everything. But unlike you, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I mean, we've heard today that, you know, interpretations of, you know, sacred text are biased towards our own opinion. But I would say that everything we read is biased to our own opinion. And the way I always see this is like, there are quite a lot of examples in sacred texts like the Quran, Torah, and the Bible, which are inherently toxic and can be seen as inherently masculine. And you know, if you ever talk to people who might be women or might be, you know, or men who disagree with them, it's very interesting. Like there's always examples. Anyone want to give me questions? I'm kind of running out of things to say. No. Go for it.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Do you think that in the context of masculinity being like self-reliance or these softer forms of masculinity that a lot of people have advocated, do you not think that self-reliance is inherently associated with relying on yourself rather than asking people for help, and thus contributes to things like men not asking for help with their mental health, and thus contributes to what creates male suicide?
Well, I've always seen self-reliance as a very feminine trait, because typically females are very good at self-reliance. If you've ever seen kind of men do actually fail at self-reliance, there is an issue now that, you know, male suicide or, you know, violent crimes committed by men who, because they haven't gone and kind of found help for, you know, mental issues. But so I would actually disagree with you. I would disagree that that self-reliance would be a trait. Sorry, don't know how to finish the sentence. I'm going to pack up because I have nothing else to say.
We're just moving on to our 2 floor speeches now. So first up is Jack Kennedy.
That was close.
We'll only be 4 minutes on that. So
I'll try. I have a lot of what to say. 4 minutes.
Okay. Man cannot change himself without suffering, for he is both the marble and the sculptor. This is not a debate about hating men. I'm a dude, and I can be accused of many things, but not having enough self-love would really definitely not be one of this. This is a question about identity, okay? And the reason I put that quote from some famous physicist I can't remember the name of, at the start of my speech, is because changing your identity is a scary thing, okay? And I'm going to talk about what happens when we try to get people to change their identities, why masculinity has become something that is, as I said earlier, such a cultural monolith, and what is a bad thing, okay? So, first of all, before I get on to anything, I'd like to point out that anything Eunice may have said about me earlier was completely unfounded rumors and did not have any weight put on it. But what are the traits of masculinity, okay? Because there are 2 words we've heard thrown around a lot during this speech. Self-reliance and dominance. Why are these bad? Self-reliance, okay, we heard from that speaker that it's more of a feminine trait, but it isn't really, okay? There's this idea that, you know, you have to just man up, you should just, you know, like pack it all up inside you, don't ask for help, never reach out to it, it's just a thing you have to deal with yourself, okay? Why is that bad? Because it's a pipe dream, because like humans are social animals, because we always have been and we always will be, and this is why we have the male suicide that Squid and Stephen were talking about in their POIs. This is why we have like such poor rates of like mental health among men. That's terrible. But the thing I mostly want to talk about is the dominance, okay? Because despite what we heard from, I'm very sorry, I've forgotten your name, our guest over here, it is like masculinity does come with dominance, okay? It's not in conflict with self-reliance. If you're the most self-reliant person, you don't need help from anyone, of course you think you'd be in charge, okay? And what does this explain? Okay, we heard lots of things on the opposition bench about things like bias in the courts against men. That's because of the dominance, because men can never be seen as the victims. So like they can never like have that in the courts. And the things about like the definition of rape, okay, like being biased against men. Yes, because once again, men can never be seen as victims because men are always in charge. You know, how could they ever be raped by a woman who's seen as like inherently lesser? Okay, it explains the problems with custody battles. Okay, because like men have this idea that they should always just be like, you know, the one making all decisions rather than dealing with the nitty gritty of the kids. Okay, that's why that happens. He explains why 6 million men died in World War I because they were dominant and they had to go win the war and they got all sent out and they all died. And that's like shit. Like masculinity is inherently harmful. Not just to women, which I'm going to talk about in a sec, but also to men because there are all these expectations of them. Okay, and what does this dominance do? It brings with us this cultural model. I'm going to stop saying that sooner or later. Like it brings this kind of this imposition of this ideal upon like men within society, but also women. Okay, and we're going to come back to misogyny in a sec. Okay, but like you can't. The reason masculinity is inherently harmful. The reason, like, despite what Shabangi says, we can't just kind of get this diet masculinity that like we kind of ascribe to only if we want to, because it has this trait of dominance, because it's this it's so like tied up with the idea of masculinity that it has to be the one thing. Okay, we're never going to be able to roll that back. What's the problem with that? That means if it is the dominant cultural narrative, it is very, very hard to move away from it. Okay, if you feel like you're not masculine enough, you can feel insecure. Why is that bad? First of all, being insecure is not a nice thing. You know, that's just generally bad for those people. But also like, it leads to prejudice. Like we had this guy come to talk to us, this rapper called Akala last week, and he said all prejudice is rooted in insecurity. Okay, like if white supremacists actually thought they were better than black people, they wouldn't care that black people were being let into Harvard because like they think they're better. Like all prejudice comes down to being a little unsure of yourself and lashing out at someone else because of that. Okay, because of this insecurity that is tied up in masculinity. This is the reason we have this patriarchy, which isn't a bunch of old white men smoking in a room, but it is something that is like tied into this idea of masculinity. It's something that's inherent to like every interaction we have every day. Okay, I know people really hate the word microaggression, but like that is what it is. Like it pervades everything we ever do, okay? And it is also that because of this, like if you don't fit every single aspect, and this is like we heard a lot of this from the proposition bench, like if you don't fit every single aspect of this like very rigid identity, you're going to be like, first of all, you're going to feel terrible yourself, but you're going to be ridiculed, you're going to be bullied. Like people are bullied. Like if I did hypothetically, watch My Little Pony, like, people would bully me for that because it'd be seen as a non-masculine thing, and that's awful, okay? But the problem with this is that I'm no better than anyone here, okay? Like I put on this tux and I'm like, yeah. I like that, in the mirror, like because I am affected by these ideas just as much as anyone else in this room. And that's the problem. That is the reason masculinity is so inherently harmful, because it can't be separated from like some really inherent things to us, okay? And until it is gotten rid of, everyone, whatever gender they identify as, will never be free. And that is why I'm so proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, despite being on side up for this debate, I'm probably not the best person to talk about masculinity. I mean, like, I'm a 5'8" debater. But when I was in the bathroom earlier, where I left the seat up, I was looking through Dominance Arian's Instagram feed, which Lab Bible linked earlier on, and I was thinking about, like, why has the pursuit of men in the modern day world, why are men pursued for being, you know, the aggressors in every situation? Why are men thought of as being the ones we're now to condemn? Because in this post-industrial, post-religion world, I think Ireland is, in particular, is quite affected by this idea of man as the dominant person. Because, you know, we've men coming out of, like, all boys schools, taught by the Christian Brothers, who, you know, are celibate 60-year-old men who haven't been out of the place in 40 years. And they're teaching the way the world used to be. So these boys are learning these, like, antiquated ideas, coming into college, where suddenly, you know, they are the other. They are the men who are, like, being held responsible for all the world's crimes. They are being brought into, like, a place which is no longer safe, you know, where men are looked upon as, you know, if we open a door, we are automatically thinking that, like, oh, we are superior to them, we have to open the door for them because they're not capable of it. And it's this hostility that men face, I think, that hasn't really been touched upon in this debate as another cause as to how this kind of proliferation of hatred against men in modern day has really developed. Because we've heard a lot about, like, the reasons behind why men are bad, but we have heard quite little about, like, how it is affecting them on a daily basis. Except for one or two references to things like, you know, the mortality and suicide rates amongst men, which is obviously a horrendous thing that shouldn't be happening in the first place. But is this why the modern man is in decline? Is this why the mortality rate is so high is because men are automatically going to this world completely unprepared for it, where, you know, they are now being viewed as something to be looked down upon. Look, I'm not saying that like some men are horrible people who like do oppress people or like harm others, and yeah, that's a bad thing. But we've heard in Eunice's speech already that just because we have a few bad apples doesn't mean we can like tar the entire men as like people who are actively going out to harm others and like exert their dominance and like not take no for an answer. Because, you know, if you're going to go out and tar a whole like species of people, generally it's a bad thing. It gets you done for libel and racism and stuff in courts. And if it's done in any other like situation, you know, we wouldn't accept it. So I think it's a weird phenomenon that has just really, you know, stumbled out of Tumblr, yay, in the last while. But, you know, you can be anti-repression, you can be anti-patriarchal, you can be like anti-patronizing and still be a man. You can be anti-violence, still being a man. And I don't see how this is kind of side proposition to have put this whole idea that like masculinity is inherently tied up with the patriarchy. And I disagree, because I feel that there are men who like can be like Ron Swanson and like want to chop wood in flannel shirts and like be bears and whatever. Don't have to. And in doing so, don't have to actively repress others. So a lot of the props points depend upon the patriarchy, like constantly exerting its influence. Yeah.
So like that, yes, men can do that without ceasing to be men, but they can't do that without ceasing to move outside the realm of masculinity. This isn't about men. This is about like this prescribed identity.
Well, I think the big thing is that like we've seen masculinity as a whole being targeted, and as a result, it's men. Like, I mean, you know, men are a subset of masculine people. You can be like a feminine, like a girl, and like want masculinity, like feel like masculinity is a thing that's necessarily good. Not that the patriarchy is good, but feel like masculinity is a good thing. I mean, we see Shubhangi here as a great advocate for that. So, like overall, I believe that the crusade against masculinity is not only like degrading to men, like by automatically assuming them to be aggressors in every situation, automatically assuming that like they are not fit to mind their children, by automatically assuming that they are going to hurt someone when they're walking down a street at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that this notion that, you know, we're now being victimized, that like, yeah, people are victimized in the world, it's a bad thing. But when it's institutionalized, become the norm and like actually like talked upon as a good thing that, you know, we're calling these people out in the modern day, I think it really does instill like harmful ideas into young men who are unsure themselves in the world. And perhaps this is why we see so many bad things happening. This is why we see so many like suicide rates and stuff. Because the tirade against men and gentlemen has become socially acceptable. And I, for one, completely oppose it. Thank you.